Okaeri, welcome back to my channel, May Between the Pages. My name is Taylor, and today we are back with another very exciting episode of Page Chewing with author Fonda Lee. I don't know if you can tell, I am a fan. I scream about the Greenbone Saga all the time, so I am just so excited, delighted to have you with us today. Also, I have my wonderful co-hosts, PL Stewart and Steve Talks Books. The three of us are almost always together, so those of you watching probably already know them. But if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little bit of a self-introduction about where you started your journey or how you found yourself with us today on Page Chewing and kind of what you do in the book space.
Sure. I'm Fonda Lee. I'm a novelist of science fiction and fantasy. I'm probably best well known for that set of books that is behind Taylor on the screen, the Greenbone Saga, which starts with Jade City and then goes into Jade War, concludes with Jade Legacy, and has been described as a modern epic fantasy Asia-inspired martial arts gangster family saga. I've never got those words out in the same order twice. I am also the author of a number of science fiction novels, Zero Boxer, Exo, and Crossfire, and I have a new novella out this week. It came out a couple of days ago called Untethered Sky.
Yes, I just read that whole thing yesterday, so in one sitting. So
much shorter than Jade Legacy.
yes, easier to read in one sitting. We just have a couple people in the chat I want to make sure I get up. Everyone's very excited. Maria's here.
Thank you,
got
Maria.
the chance to meet Fonda recently. She was beyond lovely. Philip Chase is here.
Hi,
Hooray,
Philip.
this is very exciting. Shad. Hey, Fonda and Everton. I'm excited for this one. Greenbone Saga is my favorite trilogy. Yes.
Thank
you. We love having other fans in the chat. Bo is also here. Evening, everyone. Tori, as well as Fantasy Book Addict, Sophia. So thank you, everyone, for coming by in the chat. So I wanted to start kind of with a macro scale, because as you've mentioned, you've kind of done things in different genres throughout your career. The Greenbone Saga is the one that I think most people are aware of and really shot to, I would say, fame personally, but you have done a lot of other work in your career, and sci-fi seems to be kind of a linchpin point there in your works, especially since they were your first debut novel, Shadow Boxer, or what was it? Unboxer?
Zero Boxer. Yeah.
Zero Boxer. There we go. Zero Boxer. That is a sci-fi as well. So I'm kind of curious, when you approach writing what most people would call urban fantasy and sci-fi, is there a different approach that you use, or is it just kind of the same writing process for you and then they fall naturally into one of the genres?
It really is more of the latter, in that I don't feel as though I approach writing science fiction or fantasy really differently. Some of the ideas that come to me are naturally fantasy ideas and others are science fiction ideas. And I really do think of them just as two sides of the same coin. There's always some speculative conceit, and how I wrap that around the characters and the narrative is the fun challenge for me. And so whether or not it's magic or high tech, whether it's a secondary world or far future, I really do just sort of approach them very similarly. And I think part of this is made easier by the fact that my fantasy is pretty grounded. So the Greenbone Saga is, even though there is a speculative element of the magic jade, it's treated in a very, I suppose, realistic way, in the sense that I want it to feel unmagical, if that makes sense. I'm writing a fantasy story that I want to feel non-magical. And you'll notice the characters in the Greenbone Saga never even really refer to jade as magic, because for them, it's just an ordinary part of their world and their day-to-day life. So I think that makes it just very natural for me to bounce between science fiction and fantasy, because with whether it's tech or whether it's magic, I'm always just trying to make it seem like a part of the characters' lives.
That's incredible, because that was exactly the point that I was going to make, is that in the Greenbone Saga, I hesitate to call Jade a magic system.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I find it's almost like a commodity in the world that happens to have properties that are useful. And I am not so learned in sci-fi as to say this with too much confidence, but my understanding is that in sci-fi, usually people like to extrapolate how something in that world will affect the rest of the world. Whereas in
Mm-hmm.
fantasy, it's kind of taken for granted as part of the world building. Sci-fi says, okay, if this existed, what would happen? And that seems to be very much the case in your work.
Yeah, I absolutely love going down that intellectual exercise of this is a speculative conceit, and now what are all the ripple effects, and how would that affect how people live and how cultures develop and how economics occurs in this world. And you'll notice I do that with the Greenbone saga. Jade has implications for religion and the military and government, and sports and entertainment, everything. And I think that is it is something that science fiction likes to do very often, is take that one idea and extrapolate on how it affects society. And it often is something that is very timely or pertinent, whether that's AI, or deepfake technology or surveillance or whatever it is. And because I set the Greenbone saga in a modern era and spanned a large amount of time, I could kind of do some of that that exploration that you see in science fiction in the context of a fantasy world.
When you're exploring those themes that are timely, is there ever a concern to be too close to reality, or do you try to leave a buffer there between reality and your story?
I don't really feel as though that was a concern in my case, because I wasn't working in that danger zone of near future. I think that's where oftentimes writers will have the situation where, do they end up dating themselves because they're butting up against what is happening in the real world. Because the Greenbone saga is set in what I guess I would call our near past, or of an analog of late 20th century. So many of the things that happen in that saga are very very analogous to things that happen in our own world, including Cold War politics, modernization, globalization, diaspora cultures, all of this stuff that should feel very recognizable to us happens in the Greenbone saga. But I never felt as though I needed to accurately reflect what happened in our world, because this is still a secondary world. So I didn't need to go into things I didn't want to, like I don't have a space race in the Greenbone saga. There's not, a Bay of Pigs invasion. And so that hence I can kind of pick and choose the big themes that I want to tackle, and pull them into my fantasy world without too much worry about butting up against, current day news.
Yeah, I find that fantasy and sci-fi allow you to kind of have that reflective space. They allow you to have that distance where, if you're dealing with a theme that might feel too close to home, if you use actual real world examples, if you're reading it in a world that is crafted in the way that you just mentioned, you can actually reflect on those things without your personal experiences making it too close to think about, if that makes sense. So one of the themes that I noticed a lot in the Greenbone saga, and I'm not sure if it's in your other works, but I think there's a hint of it maybe in Untethered Sky, but talking about the idea of xenophobia and nationalism and colonialism, and how those themes in our world apply to our everyday lives. And each character has a different view on those things. And one of my favorite things that you did in this series is you were very well-rounded in the different ways that people can look at this. It's not, you should feel this way, or this is correct. It's based on that character's space in the world. They felt a certain way about those themes, and you were allowed to see that from many different perspectives. And as someone who does live abroad in a country that does have these issues, I will not fit in and never will. It's a theme that really struck me. And I'm wondering, in your writing, if it's this theme or other themes, if you purposefully put those in there, or if they naturally kind of just flow from your life experience.
That's such a good question, because I think it's both.
Thank you.
It's absolutely both. I think what happens is, as writers, we set out just to tell a story, and we have cool characters and a fun premise and vibes and plot points, and we're just trying to tell a cool story. But in the process of doing so, we're unearthing all this stuff about ourselves, because you can't write anything without putting yourself in the story in some way. So what happens is you write a bunch of books, and then you look back and you realize, oh gosh, these themes do keep coming up over and over again. And you had mentioned themes in the Greenbone saga, including diaspora culture and colonialism, and those absolutely show up. For anyone who has read Exo and Crossfire, that's a huge theme there. It shows up to some extent in Zero Boxer as well. It's probably most lightly touched in Untethered Sky, which feels like its own separate thing. But yeah, absolutely, there are sort of certain things that I keep coming back to. Dysfunctional families is another one. They keep coming up. And so they do come, I think, for me, from this place of being, a second generation Asian American, and my parents were immigrants, and growing up in North America, not speaking the language of my parents, and so I wanted to represent a diaspora culture in the Greenbone saga, because it was something that I did not see in fantasy very often. Oftentimes, fantasy has these settings that feel very ancient and timeless, and there's these people who have been there for thousands of years, and a lineage of kings and bloodlines, and all the traditional fantasy tropes. And I didn't see in fantasy my own personal experience of people moving and cultures blending and trying to fit in between cultures, and the things that resonated with me. So I think absolutely my personal perspective goes into these stories, but also I don't have a heavy hand as a writer. I think it's safe to say that I tend to write with restraint when it comes to what I want the readers to take away. And one of the beauties of having this big saga with multiple point of view characters is that I could show all those different perspectives. And you're absolutely right. A character like Shay, who's gone and lived abroad and comes back to KCON, has a different view of the world than someone like Hilo, who is so embedded in the mother culture, versus someone like Andon, who goes away and is basically an immigrant in another culture or another country for some time. And so I don't want to really tell readers my experience. I just want to paint these characters as authentically as possible, and kind of make their experience feel real to the extent that I can. And some of that is fed in from my own experience.
My baby Shay. If you can't tell from the life experience I just shared, I connected with her on a visceral level in the first book. I was like, oh, it me. just opposite. So I would say that you definitely achieved that realistic. It comes through, that it comes from life experience, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. We had just a couple comments based on what we were talking about. Philip Chase says, very true about recognizable themes in Greenbone. They're a very natural part of the story, seamlessly woven in. Philip Chase, actually, I was over on his channel to talk about Jade City last week, I think. So he is going to read Jade War next, and hoping to have a conversation about that when he gets there. But we did have a discussion.
No spoilers. I'll know that.
Yeah, yeah. We'll try to keep it a little bit spoiler free, but light ones are fine, I think. But Philip is also an author himself, so I'm sure he knows that feeling. And PL as well. Do you find that the themes show up naturally for you too, PL, when you're writing? Like you almost surprised yourself with what comes out?
Yes, perhaps. I think I might be a bit more heavy-handed, more purposeful just in my writing. But I do try to make a lot of themes flow naturally. When it comes to the Green Bowl saga, and I haven't had the pleasure of reading all three books yet. I read the first one. It was fantastic. I'm so grateful to Taylor, especially for getting me onto the series. And of course, I'd heard so much about it in the community, so much praise, and well deserving the accolades.
Oh, thank you.
The one theme that I found really, there were so many things that were compelling, but I love this what you did, Fonda, with the like this complicated legacy of the clan's inception. They were they were the liberators, the resistance fighters, and then they they actually restrict crime to a certain degree, and they have these outward. Um, some of it, of course, is self-serving, but even genuine philanthropic efforts, they're and that's combined with a code of honor and this, it convolutes this perception of their actions being savage and forced dominance, right? And you don't let us forget that these are essentially bloodthirsty regimes that in some cases they prey upon the weak, they manipulate, they blackmail, they maim, they kill, do lots of these bad things in the name of self-preservation or profits. But even though it's cold-blooded and callous and violence is like the methodology, they still have this other side. And I think that's obviously exemplified with Lamb. And I think the one thing that really struck me in terms of a theme for me, and I'm not sure how purposeful this was, but for me it was, can you have members of this criminal entity engaging in these violent activities, and these organizations are by their nature they're abhorrent, they're ruthless, they're predatory, they're motivated by power and greed, but can they also be good and or noble, and can they do good or noble things? And I found that absolutely fascinating, the way you portrayed that, and so well done. So that was one theme for me that really stuck with me in reading Jade City, and I'm sure will carry forward, I'm guessing, in the other books.
I think that's safe to say, yes. They'll get more of that and more nuances to chew on. It was definitely something that I had the freedom to do because I was working within this secondary world context. Like if I had written a story about mobsters in our world, right, it would be much more black and white, because in our world, we all know the mafia is not a good organization. And even though we do love movies like The Godfather and shows like The Sopranos, at the end of the day, we know that these guys are criminals and that they're most likely going to end up behind bars. But I didn't want to write a story that was cops versus robbers. And even though I draw so much inspiration from the crime drama genre in writing these books, I also wanted to blend it with all the fantasy, epic fantasy elements, which included things like, the clash between noble houses and countries, kingdoms in conflict. And so I basically created a world where the culture and sort of some of the tropes and rituals that we associate with the mafia could be baked into basically the way this society works. And in order for it to be a fully functioning society, these clans can't just be unequivocally bad. They run the country, and so they have created a functioning society, and so they have so many of the functions of government, and that thus it places them very squarely in this somewhat conflicted moral space for the reader, right? And I'm always delighted to sort of see people try to wrestle with that, because the world and the story takes place in a moral framework that's different from ours. I know there are lots of debates out there on, certain actions that Hilo takes and whether they're justified. And
yeah, but so well done, though.
He didn't make it past Jade War for me, but I know many people who feel differently.
He's actually one of my favorite characters, Hilo. I think because he is so he's so gregarious. He's naturally he's someone who big heart, wears his heart on his sleeve. cares a lot. He's like so many people I've met, friends of mine, family members. They love hard and they get angry, but they forgive. It's over, and they kind of they don't carry grudges. Obviously, it's different context when we're talking about grudges in terms of the gang, but nominally he's not one to hold a grudge. He's looking to look past that and move on in terms of his personal relationships with his family, right? Especially Shay, because of what he holds against what he believes that she did wrong. So I love that him as a character, because I feel actually he's somewhat well rounded, right? He doesn't have Lance necessarily. Lance really cerebral and a thinker, and he's also outwardly very noble, right? And he wants to be a good leader. He optically wants to be a good leader. I'm not saying that Hilo doesn't, but Lance's style of leadership is not only pragmatic, but I think he does it with a lot of heart and a lot of compassion, which is you think about an organized crime boss, you don't think about compassion. That isn't a word you normally associate with them. So, but yeah, again, character is exceptionally well done. Sorry, I went off a bit of a tangent there, but
no, absolutely. I laughed in the middle of it because this comment, Hilo is always justified, because Sophia and I have debated this since time immemorial, whether he's justified or not, which is the sign of a fantastic character, as PL said. Even if I'm not the Hilo simp that a lot of people are, I still very much understand why people like him, because he's just fantastically crafted. There were a couple other comments here from Maria. Couldn't agree more, PL. The honor code within that complex morality was so fascinating. Yes, this was something that struck me from the very beginning, the idea of honor and saving face. It's very clearly it's present in the book, and you've mentioned many times that it's an Asian-based fantasy, but it's not one specific Asian culture. It's kind of a blend of a bunch. But as someone who's lived in Japan for a while, I recognized some things reflected from this culture as well. And the idea of saving face and what's not said being almost more important than what is said is something I find so much joy in seeing done so well on page, because I'm like, yes, because I had to learn that from the ground up. As an American, I'm like, I say A because I mean A. And it was a big culture shock when I came here, and everyone means A, but they say B, and I'm supposed to infer A from that. So I just want to say that came through the pages as well, that kind of honor code.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, that's very much what I wanted to do, was to really paint the picture of a culture that is that's recognizable, but also feels very much like its own thing, because it's been built around this speculative element. And like you said, though, there are touch points that are very clearly East Asian, that East Asian cultures do have in common. And so that was part of my job, was to make those touch points clear, and then to also infuse them with novelty and different things that make KCON stand out from the countries that we have.
Yeah, the code of honor definitely struck me as well. And what struck me is how that manifested in terms of the duels, the duels between, which I thought they were just incredible. That's where I understand that you have a background in martial arts, Fonda. That certainly played out on the pages. Those scenes were incredible. They were so well done, really thrilling. But what struck me was that because of the honor codes and how things were parsed in terms of who you could rightfully kill if you were Jade and who you couldn't, but in particular how the leaders were expected to show their prowess and participate in these duels. It wasn't just they're sending henchmen to, like the leaders themselves, were obligated to, show their. It wasn't just about showing their might as a leader and they're showing their prowess and showing that they were fit worthy to lead because they could defeat. So it was this other thing that they're taking it on themselves. They're fighting against other leaders, and that was I thought was really fascinating and really well done because you think about a criminal organization where because you think of the mafia, and in my mind, a lot of these organizations lack honor, but when you and the bosses, when they get to a certain level of the organization, aren't ones that will put themselves in harm's way to the same degree that they would when they were a listed lieutenant. But these leaders, they're willing to put their lives on the line, in terms of preserving the clan's honor, etc. So I thought that was phenomenal.
Thank you. I mean, one reason narratively is definitely just because I wanted all my main characters to be badasses and to have really cool fight scenes. So there's that justification as well.
Yes. Yeah.
You
It stuck
succeeded.
they stuck out to me as well. I think that's a really good point that PL made in a different way than fantasy usually does. Because usually it's the epic scale. It's the dramatic feeling of the moment that a lot of fantasy writers emphasize, and rightfully so. You can see John Gwynne behind me doesn't get more dramatic than Goliath Gods. But what I found so intriguing about the type of fighting that you write is it's short and it's quick, because that's what it actually is. There's not 15 strikes to the face and then someone finally falls over. It's one good strike can take someone out. And there's a particular scene where we get to see some of our main characters in action. I'll leave it that way. Finally see them in action. And it struck me because you didn't see this brutality exist in this character before. And then suddenly it comes out when it has to. So I think PL made a very good point in when you see these characters actually take action and participate in the violence, it's very realistic.
Well, that's good to hear because you're right. This isn't an epic fantasy that has big battle scenes, right? It is a very or street fight heavy story in that when the fights do happen, they hopefully do feel very just very sudden, but also inevitable, right? Like that's kind of how I wanted to feel like, oh, of course it would spill over into violence. But then but I also want the violence to feel like how it would actually happen if, if two gangs had a confrontation in the middle of the street. And, you can imagine civilians and bystanders potentially, being involved and property being damaged and, things happening very quickly and very brutally.
Yeah, and it's also very personal and always raises the stakes because when the leader is in the duel or the leader is the subject of, an attempted assassination or something, like it raises the stakes because these are the people at the top of the organization and the clan could potentially fall if the leader is taken out, right? Or if nothing else, it will be disruptive to the clan and, you have to attain new leadership, etc. So I thought that it was so personal, and because when it's the main characters involved, you're really on the edge of your seat because it's people you've probably started to care about and care what happens to them, right? If it's some lieutenant that you don't care as much, okay, but now it's really personal, which I absolutely loved, which I thought was just phenomenal. But it also I felt that because it reminded me, and I'm guessing that was your aim. It brought me back to not only gangster type movies, like more American type and Asian type gangster movies, but also specific things like kung fu movies and these one-on-one fights where like everything is on the line and just it was just and the tension was just ratcheted up so much. I love that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you definitely hit on one of the big inspirations is like kung fu flicks and wuxia movies. Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of wanted to take that sensibility, but then put it into this modern urban setting.
I mean, I know that you can't say much, but I saw in a recent interview you mentioned the previous Peacock adaptation is not in the works, but there might be something else, and this would go so well on screen if this comes through.
Your
I know you
lips to
can't say
Hollywood's
anything.
ears, Taylor.
Yes. Well, I scream enough about it. We'll see if my little voice can reach them. Before we move away from Hilo in general, I just had a couple comments about him. Those decisions always felt 100% true to his values for me, so I loved him for that. And I 100% agree with this. The consistency is absolutely there. Hilo's amazing, but makes some brutal choices. Yes, Andrew. Yes. Hilo's loyalty is admirable, but I'd hate to be on his bad side. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would not want to be there either. Then we did have a question here, which is what I find interesting is the dichotomy between Jade representing virtue while also representing power, which I guess you can imply is non-virtuous in many cases. Was that intentional?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Jade in this story can be more of a stand-in for a lot of things in our world. Whether that's especially, I'd say, like money. It could be oil, diamonds, precious gems, right? It is a stand-in for things that people value, but that in excess could corrupt. And that's made very tangibly clear by the itches, right? Which is this disease that I invented. It's what happens when you overdose on jade, essentially get exposed to too much of it. And it is, and I think that virtue and power, that combination is just something that feels very, I guess, real and realistic, because so many things in our world, you see them being considered signs of either virtue or accomplishment, but that can become corrupting or toxic, right, at a certain point as well, right? Like we value money, right? There's nothing wrong with working for a living and wanting to make money and become wealthy, but then we also see what how much power accumulates with those who control money and are super wealthy, and you see that as well with something like political power, right? There's virtue in wanting to be a civil servant, in wanting to get into politics and be an activist and make life better for citizens, but then you see politicians rise to a certain level where that power is corrupting. So yeah, absolutely, right? I wanted Jade to be this thing that's really revered by the society because it was not only unique and special to them, but was also something very valuable culturally and just societally, because it kept their country free and independent. And the fact that Jade is the reason why this little country is able to repel outside invasion makes it something that is very, very revered and important. But also, when you have people who now associate it with being worthy, being a strong leader, being green, right? That's the term that's used in world. Is there such an incredible amount of emphasis and pressure to be green? That also becomes corrupting and toxic. So I was always just trying to kind of show both sides in that. Yeah, this is Jade is good. Jade is bad. Jade is good. Jade is bad.
I think that plays very well into what we previously mentioned, is that there are many, or as you mentioned just now, that there are many things in life that are that, and very few things are just good or just bad. But something that you just mentioned, which I really did want to bring up, make sure I had the chance to pick your brain about while we were here, is your characters are one of the main things that are praised, and rightfully so, because I think we've talked about them for about 30 minutes with no problem, because they're that complex. But something for me, because I just recently reread Jade City, and something for me that stuck out that I don't hear enough people talk about is the politics in your book. And there's a lot of it. It's detailed. The foreshadowing is just fantastic when you read the series as a whole. So I know that those threads can be, or I imagine that those threads are very complicated to weave, and to weave them slowly and meticulously. So is politics something that it's kind of similar to my previous question, that you consciously want to explore, or does that naturally come from writing a crime family, as you mentioned, that is involved in politics, therefore it must be discussed? Is it naturally occurring, or?
I think it's naturally occurring just because of the premise of the story. I mean, even the way that I structured the clan, with it having a military side under the Horn and then a business side under the Weatherman, set it up so that both would have to always be present and they would always have to be interacting. Right? So like failure of diplomacy leads to the military side of the clan getting involved, but often it's the business side of the clan that is also either reaping the victories from the military side or having to cover up its defeats. The fact that is just sort of baked into the nature of the clan and the main characters meant that there was always going to be a significant amount of politics. And I don't think I went into it being like, you know what, I want to write in the series, I want to write like a ton of boardroom scenes. Like that's sort of how it turned out, because I just knew like these clans, yes, they have Jade and they have superpowers, but like they also run the economy of this country in many ways, and they're trading with outside powers and they're dealing with black market players. So the political and economic side of the clan's workings would be just as intrinsic to it as the violence. And I mean, that's not anything different than in our world, whether it's governments or whether it's like the actual mafia. Right? There's the actiony side of the story, but then a lot of development, a lot of the big turning points happen through these discussions and through these backroom deals and through schemes, and oftentimes those are the scenes that set up the big action set pieces. There's a scene in Jade War that I won't spoil, but there's a boardroom scene between Hilo and another another leader in another country, and it was a pretty delicate scene for me to write, because I had to sort of imply what happens in that scene in terms of like how the power dynamics are occurring there, that then sets up there's the sort of violent situation that happens later.
Yeah, that's incredible. I know for me it was really as well, like, and because it was so well done in Jade City, which was the book that I read so far. I know that especially in my line of work in law enforcement, you don't, it's easy to forget that organized crime groups, their sphere of influence can rise far beyond the street level, crime, and can have these huge geopolitical implications. Right. That's not what we think about when we think about street gangs, right? But then, in essence, in your world and the ones that you've created in the Greenbolt saga, Fonda, like as you said, like the Jade Warriors control the economy. They're dealing with, you have one clan that's more isolationist and their policies are more isolationist. You have one that's all about big trade, and then they have this personal onus or responsibility to control the jade, which is the major, it's a major commodity as well. Like, and then you have, essentially and from what I've only read the first book again, and there may be, I'm not sure what happens later, but it's very much depicted that, the nominal law enforcement, the police, they're kind of neutered. They're more or less just window dressing the fact that they understand who really controls the streets, and they kind of stick to writing parking tickets and things like that, right? So, and meanwhile, it's actually the actual law, is imposed by the Jade Warriors, right? The general populace doesn't go to the police when they want redress for something that happens. They're going to their clan, right? So you create this power structure it almost includes normally like the law enforcement that resides with the clan. It was amazing, so well done. But that was to me somewhat analogous, and it took me a while to think about that. Yeah, but that's somewhat analogous to the real world, where you have to factor in. We forget about how big the influence of these essentially multinational organizations or crime organizations, but how big their influence and their scope can go. But you clearly outlined that in your book, and I thought it was really well done.
Thank you. One of the fun things that I did after I wrote the Greenbone Saga was write a novella called The Jade Setter of John Loon that was a tie-in. So it's a prequel to the entire trilogy, but it has different main characters. And one of the things that made me want to write that and why I had fun writing it was because it's from the perspective of people who are very much not in that power structure of the clans. And so they do have to rely on the police. And, you get more of a view into how there's kind of these tiers in the society. And I think, it was a fun step away from the main characters that I had in the Greenbone Saga, and a nice little outside perspective.
I ate that novella up. But that does bring up to me one perspective that I think is universally hated, but is necessary, which is Barrow. He strikes feelings in everyone that talks about him. And one of my favorite ways to talk about him is my friend Tammy, actually, on Twitter, I think it was a couple of years ago now, but you were asking who would you cast in an adaptation, and she said a cockroach for Barrow, and I was like, yes, that's perfection, because he will not go away. It'll be the end of days and he'll still be there, But I do think that he does hold a narrative place, which is really important, because like you just mentioned with Jade Setter, we get so sucked into the microcosm of the lives of these people that we forget that they're the upper echelons of society. And Barrow kind of shows you the repercussions of the society that they uphold. This is what they are creating by holding this space. And as much as I agree with the casting of a cockroach, I do see that he's important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember once on Twitter, there was a thing going around of a picture book, but from a non-main character POV. And when I pitched the series from Barrow's point of view, he can sound like the hero, right? Like in his mind, he's trying to buck the system. He wants his share. He wants his piece. I'm listening to a fascinating podcast called Up Against the Mob, and it's a podcast by a former Southern District of New York prosecutor who's done tons of mob cases. And one of the things that is mentioned in that podcast, and and I'm sure has been mentioned elsewhere, is that like there's the mafia, but then there's kind of all these oftentimes the gangsters are surrounded by a whole bunch of hanger-ons and wannabes, right? So there's this glamour, I guess, the sort of seduction of that lifestyle that trickles down to a lot of people who don't have, who are probably low on the IQ scale, but kind of want to be part of it. They aspire to what they see as like this power and this lifestyle. And I sort of think of Barrow that way, right? Like he is he's a wannabe. He wants what he can't have, and what he sees as being sort of the pinnacle of society that he can't reach. And from that perspective, I have sympathy for him. I know, I know that he plays a infuriating role in the narrative, and I was frequently like writing him, I would get infuriated. But yeah, I definitely, I think as a writer, I have to have sympathy for him in order to write him, and I think some readers come around to that too in the end.
But you also show us that
I don't know.
the
Looking at the chat, I'm not so sure.
oh
Go ahead, PL. My apologies, PL.
no, not at all. But you also show us that these lower level players can have a huge impact depending on, like without spoiling, and again, it's JT we're talking about here. Lower level player, right? If they're cunning enough, right place, right time, circumstances, they can affect, things bigger, a bigger scope than just, on their little tiny corner of what they're trying to do, right? So that's one thing that struck me about his character in particular, that he gets involved in things that are far beyond the scope of what he should be, and has a big impact on these things by just basically one main action. And from there, that changes the whole course of the series potentially. So it just shows you that, yeah, that little player can have a big impact, depending on how things roll for them. So
Just wanted to show some of the Barrow comments. Hate Barrow with a passion. I'm on the Barrow Defense Squad, my favorite cockroach antagonist. And then we do have some sympathy here from Philip. Poor Barrow, he's pitted against the system. And Barrow is also at least in part a product of the system. I will not argue that one. Yes. And we'll see, Andrew, if Fonda provides you with the horrible, torturous death that you so desire. We'll see if she grants your wish. There was before we move on from Greenbone, because there are a couple other things that we want to be able to discuss, although we could talk about Greenbone for hours. There were just a couple of comments in the chat I wanted to make sure I put up. The first one was, I think you do a really good job of giving your characters distinct personalities and voices. How do you come up with them? What are your inspirations?
That's so hard to answer. I don't really know. I started off writing the Greenbone Saga with very little idea of who the characters were. It came to me mostly as just a concept and vibes, really. And I knew that I wanted it to be a family saga, but I didn't know who all the players were. So I spent some time basically developing a family that I felt would butt heads on multiple levels, and would have a bunch of really distinct, interesting characters that could all be POV characters, because they would all have there's no reason to have multi-POV characters unless they each bring something different to the table. So all of these family members really did have to be very distinct in order to justify them being POV characters. But also, I really just kind of started with archetypes. So I had in my mind, okay, there's going to be a responsible eldest brother, and then the temperamental middle child, and then the spoiled youngest child, right? Like those are really very general outlines. And when I said, okay, well, that's a starting point. It's very bland, and then I start filling in those characters and what their backgrounds are, and I have them interact with each other, and I really just kind of got to know them gradually. And I had when I set up that Hilo and Shay were about the same age and that they clashed a lot, and wrote them having interactions, then that would chisel away at their personality and reveal more of it to me every time those characters interacted with each other. So I guess that's not really a really in-depth answer to how do you actually come up with characters, other than it's sort of this constant interplay between what the plot direction is and who the characters are, because they're constantly influencing each other, and you just sort of have to keep writing and learning about the characters as you write, and then you learn more about them, so you revise, and it goes back and forth like that. But I got to a point where they just kind of were people to me, And so it actually made, even though Jade Legacy tactically was the hardest book to write because it was so big and there were so many moving pieces, and it was spanned to such a long period of time, in one aspect, it was the easiest book to write. And that was in the characters. Because by the time I reached Jade Legacy, I just knew these characters incredibly well. And I knew how they would age and how they would evolve and change as they aged. And so I could write a scene where Hilo and Shay have a conversation, and it would be really easy because I just knew how both of them talked and how they would respond to each other. And yeah, characters are, I really learned a lot about writing characters through the Greenbone saga.
I imagine so, since that's the core of it, right? at its heart, really. And then this was just a very interesting observation that I wanted to put up for food for thought. The idea that Jade and Greenbone has some things in common with the One Ring in Lord of the Rings just occurred to me as you were speaking. But Jade is perhaps more ambiguous, and that had never occurred to me either. And then Andrew says the One Ring is secretly made of jade and has gold plating.
Yeah, it's in a way. I mean, that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because in another way, I do the opposite of the One Ring, because the One Ring is just one ring, like that's it, right? And so everyone is trying to get it, and hence the like confluence of all these forces, and the big battle scenes. While as Jade, I kind of took the idea of One Ring, but then I was like, okay, but now it is a like entire industry, and it is being distributed and shipped around the world, and so it's now like the One Ring, but like as a commodity. Like if you could take the One Ring and cut it up into little itty bitty pieces, and I don't know, manufacture it or synthesize it, then what would happen to Middle Earth?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's the adaptation we need right there. That's
the
I'll
elves.
that though.
The elves start a like One Ring well, it wouldn't be One Ring anymore. It would be
cartel.
Rings.
Yeah, cartel.
So the elves start like a ring cartel.
Oh my
they
God!
control
Yes.
the ring, and then there's
then
there's tension with the Dwarf Kingdom because they want in on the ring economy. No.
Yeah. They can mine all of the sources that the elves need. Oh, this is
right.
going places.
Ooh, yeah.
That's awesome. If it's okay, I know we're going to move away from the Greenbone saga, but again, it was just captivating. I want to also compliment you, Fonda, on what you did with the lore, the mythology, wrapping the religion up with the deities in with Jade, and it just was really fantastic. And I absolutely adore the chapters where you talked about the myths, like for example, how Kikon was. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing it right. The island, Kikon,
yeah, Kekon, yeah,
Kekon.
Yeah.
That it was created from the mother goddess, falling to the ocean, and then after she made the world, and then her body was the island, and the veins of jade that were in the mountains were bones. Those were some of my favorite. You'd sprinkle these chapters in the middle of the main action. It was just amazing how you revealed the world that way. I absolutely loved it. But yeah, I just wondered, what was some of the inspiration for some of these myths, and what made you choose to expose the world building that way. You expose in other ways, obviously, but I just love those chapters where you can, you gave us this tale, this legend. I just thought it was amazing.
I really enjoyed writing the interludes because they served a few purposes for me. One was obviously giving more of the lore of this world, but the other was to punctuate the narrative. So the interludes always show up at specific points in the story that they're almost like they often hit like right at a critical juncture. And so I've always wanted to find ways for the interludes to tie in thematically to what was happening in the narrative at that particular time. So even the juxtaposition of some of the chapter titles of the interludes with what's going on in the main narrative, tie together. And I also use the interludes as a way to to make KCON feel more like a present day society. And insofar as, I wanted really like this KCON to feel like a place that exists now, but that has this really long history and its own myth and its own culture and so on. And so the interludes were a way for me to kind of to do that, to show KCON as having this this long history with Jade and like the myths and how those myths like inform the current day culture. So yeah, they were a lot of fun for me to write. And I talked about how they punctuate the narrative. They also were a way for me to make the most use of omniscient POV or omniscient author voice. Was I would have something really major happen and then yank you up to like a 10,000 foot level, and or create this sort of thematic remove, or a sort of a almost a certain emotional distance from the story for a moment before kind of diving back in.
That reminds me a lot of how some other fantasy authors use like sentient gods to pull you
Right.
up to an omniscient level. It was kind of the same feeling, and then they
Yes.
drop you back in with us mortals. So I wanted to kind of go a little bit more on the macro scale of Greenbone with a question that Bo put in chat way earlier, but I wanted to save it for now, which is, when writing the series, did you always intend for it to be a trilogy? Also, was there ever a point while writing Jade Legacy where you thought about extending it to a fourth or maybe fifth book?
I did not know it would be a trilogy when I started writing. I knew it would be hopefully more than one book, but I didn't know for sure. So I had to write the first book in a vacuum of knowledge. But once it was picked up by my publisher and I had a contract for 3 books, then I mapped it out as a trilogy because I knew there was enough material that I wanted to cover that could easily hit 3 books. Then when I was writing, I've had this question a few times though, when you were writing the third, would you have broken it up? And I think it comes from the fact that a lot of time is covered in the third book. And so if I'd wanted to fill more books, I could have broken it up into more pieces. But no, I was never tempted. I think part of it was because I just knew what I wanted the third book to be. And I sort of had a schematic in mind of how the trilogy scaffolded, the first book being the clan war and KCON, the second being really focused on sort of the international conflict, and the third book really being about that intergenerational conflict. That I would have ended up stretching that theme across multiple books. I don't think I would have. It would have maybe been fun to spend more time with the characters, but I definitely went in with an idea of what I wanted that third book to accomplish. And also I just had a whole bunch of other ideas I had to write. So no, I didn't really get tempted to extend it into 4 or 5 books.
Coming from someone who will purchase anything else in this world, I mean, the Subterranean Press already has my money, but I think that I think maybe more series, be it books or TVs or whatever, need to do that because I think it if you know where you're going and then you change it halfway through, sometimes that can show in the story. And I think why Jade Legacy had the critical acclaim it did is because it was very intentional. It was a very intentional book, and everything was wrapped up in a way that showed that it wasn't pandering in any way, shape, or form. You know, you broke a lot of people with that book, myself included, but all of the endings had a point, had a purpose. And I think, wrapping it up in that way, for me personally as a reader, was probably the best way to go. So I'm not really surprised to hear that you had that planned, because I felt that way.
I love fantasy, obviously, but I will admit I am a reluctant epic fantasy reader sometimes because I'm cautious of series that are unfinished and that I don't know when they're going to end and how much time is going to be between books, and so I didn't want to be on like the giving end of that, if you will. Like I also really love I love fantasy, but I also love stories that end. And so that was really important to me. Also, remember, Jade Legacy was my pandemic book, so I was writing it in really majority of it was in 2020, which was a trip. But I remember writing Jade Legacy, and this was morbid, but I was really motivated by this thought of, if God forbid I perish from this earth in a global pandemic, I am not leaving with an unfinished epic fantasy series. My soul will be ill at rest. And so I was just really motivated when I was writing it.
Just imagine you with like a flag with the Jade Legacy cover on it, like stamping it in the ground. I was here. Damn it.
Well, I feel that's one of the things that motivated me to start writing. Period. Because you get to a certain age, and I started writing very late, publishing very late in life, and it's like, okay, you have more years behind than ahead, and what if I don't get to put any of these books out that are in my head? So, and that's what motivates me today to keep pumping out a book every year, because I have a 7-book series, so I want to make sure at least that finishes.
Yeah, you gotta work fast.
Yeah, and I have a lot more books planned beyond that. I have 30 books planned total, at least, that I want to write. It that'll take me into my 70s, so I have 80s. So I got to get going. So yeah, I feel that, Fonda, when you said that sense of urgency, of mortality, that I have to get on this.
On the reader side, I imagine, Steve and I also feel the pressure of, we're never going to read that TBR. It's forever expanding. Yep. And I feel that in a different way. Mm-hmm. But talking about, leaving stories behind and, getting your thoughts on paper, you have a brand new book out, which came out last week. Or not last week, a couple days ago.
2 days ago.
Right? Sorry, my days are off because I'm a day ahead. But I purchased it right away, read Untethered Sky in one sitting. Tor novellas, it's worth it. It's worth it. So I wanted to give you a chance to kind of tell people about this new work. I don't want it to be overshadowed by Greenbone, because it is wonderful. So could you tell us a little bit about Untethered Sky? What can people expect?
Sure. Yeah, Untethered Sky is what I've been calling a wildlife memoir with monsters. So it is really inspired by a childhood love of wilderness adventure and animal companionship stories. So My Side of the Mountain and Julie of the Wolves and Where the Red Fern Grows, and all those stories that make you cry at the end when the dog dies. There's no dogs that die in Untethered Sky, unfortunately. But
spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert. But I wrote Untethered Sky after Jade Legacy because I really want to stretch different creative muscles. I'd written this big, epic trilogy, and I want to try my hand at writing something that was short and tight and compact and very different from Greenbone Saga. Greenbone Saga is it's urban and modern and gritty, and Untethered Sky is ancient countryside, and it takes place in a world that is loosely inspired by ancient Persia, and it's more delicate and contemplative. It's a single POV story about a young woman named Esther who is training monsters. She trains rocks to hunt man-eating manticores, and it was definitely sort of right project, right time for me, and a way for me to just try something completely different, a story that I actually have had in my mind for a very long time, and finally found the outlet for it.
Something that stuck out to me in the book is it definitely has the animal companion piece that you mentioned. It's kind of the core of the book. But something that stuck out to me as different is you really seem to emphasize the merciless, brutal nature of the wild. It's not like telepathically, this is my best friend. It doesn't have those vibes at all, which a lot of fantasy companionships do have. Yeah. So I'm curious what inspired you to take that very, not like unique, I guess, is the best word I can think of. Stance that we usually don't see, or perspective we usually don't see with
Yeah.
animal companionship, which is very, well, I guess grounded, just as you say Greenbone is. But I'm wondering where that inspiration came from.
Oh, I think it comes from two places. One is an actual real fascination with the sport of falconry. So I, remember being fascinated by birds of prey for quite a while. I've been on hawk walks and visited raptor centers, and I had a couple of master falconers beta read the manuscript, and so I was just kind of fascinated with the actual details of falconry, including all the little things like how the process of training a hawk to the hood, and jesses and lure training and all those very tactical things. I imagined them, but like with a bird that was gigantic. So those little tangible details made it into the novella and make it feel more grounded, like you said. But the other reason is honestly just because I think that is my MO now. Like I think I take speculative elements and fantasy and then make them very not magical. And in the sense that like I want them to feel very normal. And so yeah, you're right. There's no telepathic bond. I love all those stories. I remember reading Dragon Riders of Pern and like the Temeraire novels. Like I enjoyed a lot of those books, but yeah, there's no kind of sweet fuzzy animal sidekicks or telepathic soulmates, like nothing like that. It's shoveling a lot of bird shit is like definitely part of Esther's experience. But then I think I have that tendency to do that. Like I'll look at fantasy elements or science fiction elements and then sort of think about the practical implications. Like, yeah, being telepathically bonded to a dragon would be amazing, but like, how much does a dragon eat? And like, just, how much trouble would it be to clean the crap out of your dragon's pen like every single day? Like changing the litter box is hard enough. So those sorts of, I don't know, that's just sort of what I think about. And I definitely know there are readers out there who are like, Fonda Lee's magic always feels like very like not magical or like not high fantasy, which is true. My fantasy I think has been described as low fantasy, and I can kind of see that as well. It's it sort of just becomes part of people's day-to-day life, and training a giant bird that could eat your face off would be pretty difficult.
Yes. My husband at one point said, what do you think? Because we have a snake and some not usual pets. He's like, what would you think about an owl? And I Googled it for 2 minutes and said, absolutely not.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
They take so much time and effort.
Yeah. I mean, I did a lot of research into falconry as part of writing the novella. And as much as I think it would be, I think it's the super cool pastime, but the amount of time and patience and investment that goes into it is not something that would ever work with my lifestyle.
Yeah. They need all your love. And, same thing with a snake. Do they return it?
That's right.
My Pretzel's very healthy, but I don't know if he could. He might try to eat me. He can't, but he might.
If he was huge, if he was like 10 times the size that he is now.
Scale him up, right? I read Untethered Sky and felt betrayed by the end. And would you consider expanding upon this world?
I really didn't intend to. I conceived of it very much as a one and done. I feel like it's it's sort of a little break in my my writing schedule, insofar as I wrote this huge trilogy, and then I wrote a novella, and now I've got other big books planned. So I don't imagine that I'm going to expand on it, and I do hope that it's this thing that you can just consume and enjoy in a sitting or two.
Can confirm. Recently did that, so. But the time always goes so incredibly fast. We're already over an hour here. We don't want to take too much of your time. But as Stephen PL know, I always try to slip this question in if I can when it's on my channel. But in the same way that PL said he loves the mythology that you wrote in your book, I am also obsessed with those types of things. And that extends to knowing the histories and what makes people who they are individually. So I like to ask our guests, is there a story from not necessarily your childhood, but a formative story, whether it be a video game, a movie, a TV show, a book, that you think has helped kind of shape you into the writer or the reader that you are today, in the way that you do ground things and, the way that you approach stories? Is there something that you think influenced that in your life?
Oh my gosh.
I know it's a big question.
It is. And, it's hard to pinpoint a particular work because it feels more like a whole body of work, that I consumed early on in life would have informed it in a whole bunch of different ways. So like, it's hard for me to parse out like who influenced me more, like Asimov or Bradbury or, was it Chronicles of Narnia or was it Prydain? Like, so there's a lot of stuff. But I think probably one of the most formative series for me was Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern. And I think it hit me at a certain time in my life, I think it was in my teens, that it just made an impact. And for a few reasons. One, because she was a woman author who was creating these like big, expansive, complicated fantasy world, while before I had read a lot of dude authors. And then on top of that, she did something that just really like clicked with me, which was she blended science fiction and fantasy. And, the idea of these dragons, right? It starts off feeling very fantasy, but then you learn the background of it and it's very science fictional. And that was, I think, maybe the first book or series that I read that fit pretty squarely in kind of like this fuzzy area between the genres and blended sci-fi and fantasy. And I think that's something that I took away that I do is I like to play in those spaces between genres. And the Greenbone Saga is a good example of this, where it's blending of fantasy and crime drama and kung fu, but sort of the fantasy has also got a science fictional sort of tinge to it. And Untethered Sky is a mix of fantasy, but also like memoir and wildlife adventure. And so I like that. And I think that's partly something that I got from her books.
I've had them recommended to me many times, so they are on my ever expanding TBR. Haven't read them yet, but have you guys?
I've never reread them. So I read them pretty young, like relatively early in my life, and I'm scared to reread them. It's kind of one of those things. Like another book that I would say had a pretty formative effect on me was Wrinkle in Time, which I loved when I was a child. But then when I tried to reread it with my own kids, it didn't hit the same. And so now I'm terrified to reread everything that I loved when I was young. Sometimes it's better when it's just like the feeling of it and the nostalgia.
Yeah, I had the series, what was it? Calling on Dragons, Searching for Dragons. I reread that book tons when I was little, and I reread it. The first book hit, and then the rest didn't, and I was like, oh no, what have I done? The rose-tinted glasses, I've shattered them. So I feel you on that. We just had one kind of not specifically book-related question, but Bo says, hey, Fonda, is there any updates you can share with us on the Kraken Book Co. replacement Dust Jackets? Was there a recall on Dust Jackets?
I do not have any idea what's happening on that front, honestly. I mean, they contacted me for the licensing rights way back when, and so there was a deal signed, but no, I have not received any updates. I'm sorry, and I unfortunately don't have any creative control or involvement with on the merchandising side.
Yeah, that's something we didn't really get to talk about today because time goes so quickly. But PL and Steve are both, PL being an indie author and Steve being someone who reads a lot of indie. We often talk about the difference between traditional publishing and that type of contracting and indie publishing and the pros and cons of both. But it seems like some traditional publishing, there's more space between the author and the product than you would envision.
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely, you have on one hand, it's a blessing and a curse, right? On one hand, you don't have to deal with all of the things that indie authors do have to think about all the time, and get really deep in the weeds. But then on the other hand, things go wrong and you don't have control over them at times. I tweeted, I think it was a week ago or so, a couple of weeks ago, that a recent run of Jade War had about 3 chapters missing, and an entire 32 odd pages of an entire book on the I think it was called New World, the French history of the French Revolution. Just I can only imagine what it must be like as a reader to hit that. So yeah, things like that.
I'd never seen anything
after
like that
other
before.
People have heard about it.
Yeah, I have the matte cover of Jade City still because they did that weird release where they didn't do the shiny one.
Yeah. Like, and that was something that I found out about later and had to send a whole bunch of emails to my publisher and eventually get it sorted out. But yeah. Sorry about the mismatched covers. I know that bothers me too.
Of course it bothers me, but you don't have to apologize. I don't mind giving you more money for another copy later. But oh, well, this was just a wonderful conversation. We really, really appreciate your time. Before we go, though, I'd just like to give everyone on the screen, PL, Steve, and yourself, of course, a chance to kind of sign off, tell people, where they can find you, what work they can expect. You mentioned a book that I know that you've teased on Twitter, some other larger books coming out. Anything you'd like to mention before we go? Maybe we could start with Fonda and then just go. I can't point. You guys know that way.
Depending on what order we're on the screen. You can find me online. My website's fondalee.com. I'm on Instagram at fonda.lee, Twitter at fondajlee, and I have a Patreon, patreon.com/fondalee. I have a new book out, Unto the Sky, which we've talked about, so you can get that anywhere that books are sold. There will also be an audiobook edition of it that comes out soon. And I am working on more novels. Most currently is a science fiction duology that has just recently been announced. The first book being called The Last Contract of the Sako. And you will have to wait a while. It will not be out until 2025. I have to finish writing it. But I'm very excited about it. It is my cyberpunk samurai space opera.
Nice.
Those are good buzzwords. Steve, you want to take it away?
Yeah,
next?
Sure. Before I do I just want to thank Fonda again for spending, and we know you're very busy, so thanks for hanging out with us. We appreciate it. For me, you can find me on Steve Talks Books or Steve Talks Movies on YouTube or at pagechewing.com. I'm easy.
Yeah, you got your pitch down to an art.
Yeah, enough practice, yeah. And PL?
What about you, PL? Yeah.
Yeah, I also want to say thank you so much, Fonda, for joining us. One of the usually anticipated episode. Can't wait to get in to read the rest of the Greenbone saga. Hopefully, get into the next book next month. And PL Stewart. You can find me mostly on Twitter, my preferred social media platform at PL Stewart Writes. The books, www.plstewart.com, and of course, Page Chewing beside my wonderful co-host. That's where you can find me in terms of the YouTube space for the most part. And also, Before We Go blog, where I'm an assistant editor. You can find my reviews there and on Goodreads. And, including a review of Jade City, which is, again, phenomenal book that I loved. And I can't wait to read the rest of the series and more books from Fonda Lee, including Untethered Sky. And congratulations on the new release.
Thank you. Thanks, PL.
If you are watching this, somehow don't know who I am, this is my channel. My name is Taylor. My channel's May Between the Pages. You can find me, just as PL and Steve said, next to the two of them on Page Chewing on either my channel or Steve's channel, or we're manifesting PL's channel We're manifesting it. We'll see in the future.
Soon.
Yes. You can also find me on Twitter. I do a lot of book interaction there, and on Before We Go blog, where I am also an assistant editor. But as everyone has said, and I also already said, I suppose, but thank you so much for joining us, Fonda.
Thank you, all three of you, and to everyone in the audience.
Maria says, thanks for a wonderful discussion. Yes, I second that. So thank you to everyone in the chat for joining us. It always really enriches the experience to have you guys dropping comments and questions. Feel free, if you're watching this afterwards, to drop a comment and down below in the comment section, and we will respond. But thank you everyone for being here, and we'll see you on the next episode. Bye.